Wake up. It's the Sleep Unplugged podcast, episode 101, Sleep and the Armed Forces. Join the military service. Welcome, everyone, to the Sleep Unplugged podcast. My name is Chris Swinder. I'm your host, neurologist, and sleep specialist, and very happy you're here for episode 101. We're forging into the 100s. Excited that you could be with us and that you're part of it. If you're new to the Sleep Unplugged podcast, welcome. If you're a veteran of the podcast, welcome back. And speaking of veterans, if you're listening the first day that this is released, it's being released on Memorial Day 2024, formerly called Decoration Day. Memorial Day is the day that we have set aside to recognize people who have died while serving their country in the military. And I thought, because it was Memorial Day and because I just came back from the commencement ceremony and commissioning ceremony at the United States Naval Academy, I thought this would be a great topic: sleep in the military, sleep in the armed forces, for this week's episode of the podcast. So, as I mentioned before, and I've talked about this on the show, I have a son at the United States Naval Academy, or was at the United States Naval Academy. He and his fellow midshipmen graduated and either commissioned into the Navy or commissioned into the United States Marine Corps. I want to congratulate all of them for their 4 years of hard work and commitment, supporting one another. It was really great to be a part of the ceremony. And as you know, the ceremony is one part college graduation. These men and women graduated with degrees in engineering, political science, you name it. They're graduating with those degrees, but then they're also commissioning into their respective branch of the military service and either becoming an ensign in the Navy or I believe a second lieutenant if they're going into the Marine Corps. So really excited for them all and really fun to be a part of it. So this week's, if you want to get in touch with the show, you can find us on Facebook. You can find us on Twitter, Dr. Chris Winter. You can find us on Instagram, Dr. Chris Winter. We have a YouTube page with the videos of all of our content. We also have a Spotify playlist where we talk about the musical inspirations for all the titles of our episodes. And we put all those songs on the Spotify playlist. You can find that Sleep Unplugged Spotify playlist, Volume 2. We always start our show off with comments, corrections, criticisms. And as I mentioned last week, I wanted to highlight a review we got of the podcast from a listener who calls themselves evidence-based. Evidence-based wrote, "I love this podcast. I'm a therapist trained in CBTI, and I am so glad this podcast exists to spread the word. Also, I never thought I would cry listening to a sleep podcast, but Chris speaks to sleep disorders and patients experiencing them in such a compassionate manner, totally moving to listen to him speak. I sent a nurse friend the one about shift work, and she sobbed in her car to hear someone acknowledge the recipe for postpartum depression, shift work, and new moms. Thank you for sharing all of this info in such an accessible way. It's the best." Well, thank you, evidence-based. You're the best for taking the time out of your busy schedule to write that. We here at the podcast really appreciate it. One final housekeeping note: last week's episode we did in honor of the 100th episode, 100 tips and tricks and sleep secrets and hacks that you could do to improve your sleep. We're going to tinker with them a little bit because as we went through them, some of them kind of echoed others. But I told you that I would count up the number that I do, and it was 87. There were 13 on there that I'm not implementing right now or not good at. The one that I really want to hit hard is bright light when I wake up, and also breathing techniques are things that I feel very strongly about. In all honesty, I'm just not doing them in my life right now the way I should. I do some yoga, but the breathing thing is something I really want to go deeper in, especially after our recent podcast about sleep and breath work. So for our musical artist this week in our title, Join the Military Service. That is a line from the Iggy Pop song Loco Mosquito. That was his that was off his fourth album entitled Soldier, which I thought was especially meaningful given the topic this week. And as listeners of the podcast know, I love David Bowie. David Bowie and Simple Minds actually sing backup on the song off this album called Play It Safe. Bowie actually helped write that song as well as the song we were talking about, Loco Mosquito. Iggy Pop, born James Newell Ostberg Jr., and David Bowie had a very long relationship going back to before Iggy Pop was a solo artist. He was the lead singer of the group The Stooges. He had met David Bowie and they collaborated quite a bit on Raw Power, which was a seminal work by Iggy Pop and the Stooges. But David Bowie also worked a lot with Iggy Pop's first two albums, solo albums, The Idiot and Lust for Life. I got a chance to actually interview the bassist for the Stooges, Mike Watt. He played bass for the Stooges in many of the iterations of that group. And if you look up Mike Watt sleeping around, you can find my interview with him. It was really one of the best interviews about sleeping in a band that I think I've ever done. I really treasure that. It's one of my favorite pieces of writing that I think I've ever done. So we'll put Loco Mosquito on there, and just want to give a big salute to all the men and women who are currently serving in the armed services. And certainly Memorial Day is a day for remembering those who've passed away, and we're thinking about those individuals as well too. So let's talk about sleep in the military. This is a really interesting topic in a lot of different ways. One is having sort of bore witness to an individual going through a service academy. It's not the best place for sleep. In fact, my son was a really big proponent of sleep as a high school student. He was a swimmer, so he kind of had to be. And I think the adjustment from high school to college in the service academy was a big one for him. I think the lack of sleep, particularly during his plebe year, that first year, I think was very difficult. And there actually is research about that, not necessarily at the United States Naval Academy, but at the United States Military Academy, also called West Point. There was a 2010 study called Longitudinal Study of Sleep Patterns of United States Military Academy Cadets. This was a stratified study looking at 80 cadets over the 4 years they were in school. So at West Point or the Naval Academy or the Air Force Academy, these service academies function as colleges. So these individuals graduate, midshipmen, cadets. I'm not sure what the Air Force, I think they're called cadets too. At the end of their 4 years, they have a college degree, and then they're commissioned into the military branch that they went to for a period of service. So, United States Naval Academy, you graduate after 4 years, and then you're committed to at least 5 years of service. If you're going to be a pilot, I believe it's 8 after that time. And then you can stay in longer, or after your service is up, you can opt to get out, and you have a college education that's paid for, as well as 5 to 8 years of training in some specific field. So they actually looked at the 80 cadets over a 4-year period. And on average, these United States military, these West Point cadets are averaging less than 5.5 hours of sleep on school nights. It's 5.3 hours. And on the weekends, I think it's slightly higher. Versus if you look at age-matched individuals who are not in service academies, that number is somewhere around 7 hours, 4 minutes, according to one study I found. So we're talking about a 2-hour difference on average night to night. Now, that's nighttime sleep. It's not quite as bad as it would look on the surface, because these cadets napped extensively. And I remember watching on Showtime prior to my son going to the Naval Academy, they actually followed the Naval Academy football team. So it was like, a 12-week series on Showtime, and every week they kind of, followed midshipmen around who played football, talked to them about their duties on the yard, and then they kind of highlighted their preparation for that football game. And it was a really interesting look. I remember vividly midshipman football players napping in their football lockers, because if you're an athlete at a service academy, when you're doing your athletic work, practices, games, and whatnot, a lot of the regulations are sort of relaxed. Like when you're with the football team or you're with the swim team, you're sort of outside a little bit of the auspices of the people who are training you. Now, you're still obviously a West Point cadet when you're on the football team, but you might be able to sneak into a team room and take a little nap or get a nap where you're getting treatment. So napping is extensive. And 26% of cadets were sleeping at least once a day. Or I'm sorry, when you looked at all the cadet days, 26% of them featured napping. So a lot of napping going on to make up for the lack of sleep they're getting at night. Cadets slept more during the fall than the spring, which I thought was pretty interesting. May have something to do with the intensity of the fall semester, particularly that first fall semester. 27% more sleep was occurring on weekends. And there was dramatic differences between male and female cadet sleep patterns, with males consistently receiving less sleep than females, 21 minutes for nighttime sleep, 23 minutes for daily sleep or napping. So that's great. These are the young officers in training, cadets, midshipmen, Air Force recruits. You've graduated, you've thrown your hat in the, I'm sorry, your cover in the air, and the Blue Angels fly over the stadium, and it's really exciting. And now you're an officer. So things get much better when you become an officer in the Army or the Navy or the Air Force or the Marines, right? Well, not so fast. In 2011, there was a behavioral sleep medicine article entitled Sleep and Fatigue Issues in Continuous Operations, a survey of U.S. Army officers. So this is 49 Army officers with recent combat experience. And despite an Army policy, and we'll talk about military policy a little bit later in the podcast, despite policies requiring these individuals to develop and implement sleep management plans, nearly 80% of these participants reported they had not been briefed on a sleep management plan during their most recent deployment. They had no idea that there was supposed to be a plan in place to help ensure that they were getting adequate sleep. Over one half of the respondents in the survey reported that fatigue was a big problem for themselves as well as their units. And during high operational tempo, meaning you're deployed and you're doing your job, you're not just kind of sitting around waiting for your orders, which occupied nearly half of their time. Participants reported receiving only 4 hours of sleep daily. 82.6% reported feeling sleep deprived at least occasionally while at this high tempo. That's big. And when you start thinking about, well, what do we need our military men and women to do? I would say pretty definitively, we need them to do many things that strongly depend upon their ability to get rest, make quick decisions, make good decisions, take in data, analyze it, make the right call. There are lives at stake here. And when these operators are working at their peak and only getting 4 hours of sleep at night, this is sleep deprivation. And when we talk about insomnia and the differences between insomnia and sleep deprivation, This is sleep deprivation. Not only is it sleep deprivation, it's sleep deprivation in a group that really can't afford to be sleep deprived. 2022 study, Sleep of Recruits Through Basic Military Training and its relationship with stress, recovery, and fatigue. So they looked at daily mean sleep amounts for military individuals in training. This was in another country, I believe it was Australia, and showed that it was their numbers were about 6.3 hours per night. The main effects of the deficiencies that they saw in terms of their sleep was that it showed the highest or the strongest relationship with stress, recovery, and fatigue. And so that stress, recovery, and fatigue are the things that we're trying to avoid with adequate sleep amounts. That when you're not getting the sleep that you need, this study basically said that stress levels went up, their ability to recover their bodies went down, and fatigue went up. So, regulations, I actually mentioned around the time of the eclipse, I went and gave a lecture to Air Force pilots. And one of them was kind enough to send me the Air Force regulations regarding sleep. This is not classified information. You can look it up. And what it says is Section 3.1, Crew Rest. Commanders and supervisors will ensure air crew are provided a 12-hour rest opportunity prior to the beginning of flight duty period. Crew rest is free time and includes time for meals, transportation, and an opportunity for at least 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep. That crew rest cannot begin until the completion of official duties. Crew rest is compulsory for aircrew members prior to performing any duties involving aircraft operations and a minimum of 12 non-duty hours before the flight duty period begins. So in other words, I finished up my day and now I'm on the clock. I get 12 hours off with at least 8 of those being designated for sleep. And it was interesting. It said sleeping provisions are crew bunks or other MAJCOM defined rest facilities aboard the aircraft. Rest facilities should provide adequate privacy and noise levels to obtain suitable rest. That's it. That's pretty much the entire policy in the Air Force about sleep and rest. So it's interesting when they talk about the sleep provisions or the crew bunks as, these things should have enough privacy and be quiet enough to get rest. It brings up the question, well, what are the obstacles preventing military people from getting the amount of sleep that they need? Well, there's a 2019 study out of military medicine called A Review of Environmental Barriers to Obtaining Adequate Sleep in the Military Operational Context. So the two most identifiable barriers that they felt like were the easiest to mitigate were light and noise. Others were air pollution and temperature were a bit more difficult to mitigate. I mean, imagine yourself sleeping underneath a ship. Maybe the ventilation isn't great. You're not circulating air that wonderfully. I remember at one point talking to somebody where they were sleeping in a bunk literally next to a torpedo bay, and it was really loud for some reason. So light and noise, you might be able to wear some earplugs and an eye mask. That air pollution and temperature might be a little bit more difficult to address. They also felt like harsh sleeping surfaces were another critical impediment to sleep. And I laughed when I read that, thinking about the racks that the Naval Academy students live in. They're often sleeping on this tiny little foam mattress that's, just a few inches thick, and they don't even get underneath their covers because they're so disciplined about keeping their rack looking perfect. They actually make their bed and sleep on top of it so they don't have to make it when they get up. So I think, looking at these types of things are extremely important in terms of, listen, how can we make things incrementally better for the men and women serving in our military? Can we get them better surfaces to sleep on? You know, sleeping masks, earplugs, etc. Now, earplugs and masks can be difficult in terms of if you're sleeping in a situation where you might need to respond to an alarm, having something in your ear might not be an easy thing to deal with. Like I remember when I was on call in my residency program, sleeping in silence and earplugs and things like that were not an option because I had to be able to hear if I was being called, to the emergency room or on the ward that I was working. A 2021 study in military medicine called a qualitative examination of factors that influence the sleep among shipboard sailors. So they felt that the things that were really affecting their sleep were number one, stress. Number two, the bizarre rotating schedules. And, I have little peeks into the lives of different individuals. And I've talked to military people in the Navy for years, and they have presented me some of the craziest sleep schedules I have ever heard in terms of, we're on 3 hours watch and then we sleep for 3 hours and then we have 3 hours of free time. I mean, it just unbelievably difficult to sustain. Number three, environmental factors. We've just talked about noise, light, air, air quality, temperature, etc. Number four, prioritizing other activities over sleep when off duty. So that revenge procrastination that we have talked about is definitely a thing within the military. Many participants in the study did not report using any specific strategies to improve their sleep while underway. And amongst those who did, they felt like there was a lot of things working against them. Again, want to wear earplugs, but can't because they have to listen for alarms. And a lot of times these individuals are telling you that not only do they not know of the standards that relate to their sleep, they're not given any sort of training on how to make the situation they have better. And the only strategy that was spoken of consistently was ingesting caffeine to help them stay awake while being fatigued. And I'm almost certain, this study was done in 2021. I have a hard time believing that products like Zen, that those nicotine sort of pouches that it's almost like dip, I am almost certain that Zen would be a part of the typical sailor's strategy for dealing with fatigue in 2024. And if I'm wrong, you let me know. A 2024 study in the Frontiers of Neurology, Sleep Duration and Perceptions of Sleep Quality in British Army Recruits during basic training and observational analysis felt like in this study, the most commonly reported disturbing factors identified during basic training were late night military administrative duties like ironing your uniform for the next day, making your rack, cleaning your boots, getting your kits set up, as well as early morning wake up times, extraneous noise. When we were at the Naval Academy for the commencement, we toured Bancroft Hall, which is the largest continuous dormitory, I believe, in the world. All the midshipmen for all 4 years live in this one building. So you can imagine that there's a lot of noise going on at that time, a lot of yelling, a lot of things like that. Light, hot room temperatures within the primary sleep environment, the bed and mattress discomfort, sore muscles from the physical nature of their training, as well as, again, stress and anxiety, which stress and anxiety probably peaks the first year, and with every subsequent year is probably dropping to some degree. Although there have been studies saying that final year of military training, stress and anxiety go up because of a lot of the responsibilities that you have, as well as you're getting ready to commission into the armed forces. So that creates some anxiety as well too. 2023 study, Journal of Sleep Research, sleep deficiency, operational fatigue, and the interplay of compromising factors analysis to aid in fatigue management. So this was a study of 7,600 sailors on 73 ships. No group that was surveyed averaged more than 7 hours of sleep per night, and fatigue-induced occupational functional impairment was directly related to any sleep deficiencies that these sailors had. So, what are the consequences of these? Why do we care about this? Well, there is clearly operational consequences to this, making decisions, etc. But stepping aside from those quickly, in 2018, there was a study in military medicine called Increased Risk of Upper Respiratory Tract Infections in Military Recruits who report sleeping less than 6 hours per night. So these individuals in these training facilities who were sleeping fewer than 6 hours per night were 4 times more likely to be diagnosed with the upper respiratory tract infection compared with participants who were sleeping 7 to 9 hours. And each one of those upper respiratory tract infections resulted in about 3 lost training days. And when you look at something like the Naval Academy or West Point, these training days are critical. They're critical. I mean, they don't want to miss even a single training day. So when you start getting out into the fleet or the Marine Corps, missing out on days can be really problematic when you're looking at a population like the military. So what do we do about it? Well, instead of sort of talking about things there's a lot of obvious things we could do: get better beds, ensure more sleep, I mean, all the things that we talk about doing in residency but never do. I'm sure the military has even more obstacles, but there are certainly people who are working on trying to change policies to make sure there is more sleep because it's in the military's best interest. They will function better, they will have less problems, fewer issues will blow back on the military, and maybe they'll actually have more operational days because people will be, less sick, less impaired, fewer mental health issues, better stress management, etc. I wanted to highlight 2 individuals. One is Dr. Rachel Markwald. She's with the Sleep Tactical Effectiveness and Endurance Laboratory, which is part of the Warfighter Performance Department in the Naval Health Research Center. And she's done some remarkable research at looking at the sleep of military personnel. Also, the Naval Medical Research Center Command, the Operations Research Department, the Naval Postgraduate School. Nita Shattuck, she's a doctor who does a lot of circadian research and timing research, looking at military people and how to best implement their schedules to make them as operational and functional as they can be. So there are some really amazing people out there within the military who have taken it upon themselves, both as scientists and medical professionals, to look at the sleep of the men and women who defend this country, sacrifice a lot to protect the things we do, and make sure they're getting the sleep that they deserve. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank everyone out there who serves in the United States military. I also wanted to thank the fine people at the Acme bar in Annapolis, Maryland. We went out the night after commissioning to Acme, which was my son's favorite place to hang out with his friends, and they could not have been nicer. They were really supportive. And when you're in a military kind of situation, having a place where you can go to that's not at the academy is extremely important to unwind, blow off a little steam. And I think the people at Acme certainly treated the midshipmen extremely well. Appreciate the t-shirt, appreciate the hospitality, and appreciate everything that you find men and women do in our military. We are big supporters of you at the Sleep Unplugged podcast. Hope everyone out there is having a wonderful Memorial Day. And until next week, sleep well.